All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're going to break down a really compelling analysis from Dr. Nidal Shouker, which takes a hard look at the immense challenges Iran is facing right now. His whole point is that the country's standing at a pivotal moment, and it's a direct result of some very specific choices made over the last 4 decades.
And the analysis kicks off with this really powerful statement, a decisive crossroads. What does that mean? Well, as we're about to see, it's a choice between, profound change on one hand or continuing down this path toward isolation and just national exhaustion. The stakes really couldn't be any higher.
And that really brings us to the core question that Dr. Shouker's work is trying to answer. I mean, think about it. Iran is a country with huge oil reserves, incredible human capital, and this deep, rich history. So how on earth did it get here, to this point? Well, his analysis boils it down to 4 key reasons, which he calls the regime's strategic sins.
So let's tackle the first one. Dr. Shouker argues this is the most fundamental problem of all, and it has to do with the very foundation of the state. Simply put, it's the failure to build a modern, open nation that serves all of its people.
And what's so striking here is the contrast, right? You look at 1979, and the hopes, the aspirations, were all about social justice, the rule of law, human dignity. But the reality that actually took shape, according to this analysis, it was the exact opposite. A closed ideological system where these unaccountable power networks kind of operate above the law.
And, Dr. Shouker's analysis really lays out the devastating consequences of making that choice. Freedoms, especially for women, were crushed. The country found itself politically and culturally isolated, and this created a deep national identity crisis. The state's institutions, instead of serving the people, became tools for control.
Okay, that leads us right into the second sin, which is all about the economy. And the core argument here from Dr. Shouker is that Iran's incredible economic potential was basically squandered because ideology always came first.
And this chart really paints a clear picture of the problem, doesn't it? Instead of pouring all that wealth into things like infrastructure, schools, and just developing the country for its own people, huge chunks of it were siphoned off. They were funneled into exporting the revolution, bankrolling regional proxies, and padding the pockets of these unaccountable institutions.
And the key takeaway here is that this wasn't some abstract policy debate, It had very real impacts on people's lives. Living standards dropped, unemployment went up. And yeah, international sanctions were definitely a factor, but the analysis argues the real problem was this deep, systemic mismanagement and a total lack of transparency. And who paid the price for it all? Ordinary citizens.
All right, that brings us to the third sin Dr. Shouker points to, a flawed defense strategy. Basically, a military doctrine that prioritized all the wrong things, creating this powerful offense, but leaving the country with a dangerously fragile defense.
I mean, just look at this trade-off. The analysis lays it out so clearly. The regime poured tons of money into ballistic missiles and drones, all these tools of destructive power. But while they were doing that, Dr. Shouker argues, they totally neglected their own basic defense. This left their airspace wide open, their most vital facilities exposed, and even made it impossible to protect their own senior figures.
And this brings us to the fourth and final sin outlined in the analysis, and you could argue it's the most self-defeating one of all. A foreign policy that was just constantly hostile toward its own neighbors, its natural partners in the Gulf.
Now, here's a really fascinating psychological insight from the analysis. It suggests that seeing the stability and prosperity of the Gulf states was actually a huge source of embarrassment for the regime. It kind of begged the painful question back home, wait, why can't we have that? And so, the thinking goes, this led the regime to treat its neighbors as a threat that needed to be undermined instead of a model they could maybe learn from.
And this quote from Dr. Anwar Gargash, which is cited in the research, just perfectly captures the result of that whole approach. This hostility, he says, missed the address. In other words, their war was with the wrong people. Instead of building alliances in the region, they just ended up reinforcing this idea of Iran as a source of instability, and that left them totally isolated right at the moment they needed friends the most.
So when you put all 4 of these pieces together, the closed state, the captured economy, the flawed defense, and the hostile foreign policy, you start to see the very clear picture that Dr. Shouker is painting of exactly how Iran ended up at this really precarious crossroads.
You can almost think of it as a 4-step recipe for isolation. Each one of these choices just reinforced the others, and it created this system that, according to Dr. Shouker, always chose ideology over smart statecraft, confrontation over the national interest, and trying to dominate over building partnerships. And, well, that's what led the country right to where it is today.
And that brings us full circle, right back to the beginning. The analysis wraps up by framing this as a real moment of truth. You know, history shows us again and again that when regimes just stop listening and keep repeating the same mistakes, they become incredibly fragile. So the big question the analysis leaves us with isn't really about outside pressure. It's about an internal choice. Will Iran choose a new path, or will it just keep going down the same road to deeper isolation? That final choice, as Dr. Shouker concludes, is the ultimate lesson of history.